Welcome to Colorado State University's podcast, The Audit, where host Stacy Nick talks with CSU faculty about topics ranging from their latest research to current events.
Ever had that feeling? You know the one. The hair on the back of your neck stands up, and you're overcome by the eerie sensation that you've been in this exact situation before. It's that creepy feeling of déjà vu, and it's one that almost everybody experiences at some time or another. But what is déjà vu, and why does it happen? Is it a psychic premonition? A message from the other side? A memory from a past life? While it's long been the subject of horror movies and books, it turns out déjà vu isn't really all that paranormal. In fact, it's actually pretty normal, according to Colorado State University psychology professor Cleary. Cleary researches human memory, specifically when that memory is just out of reach, such as with déjà vu or those moments when the word you want is right on the tip of your tongue. Today I'm speaking with Cleary about what actually happens when you experience this memory phenomenon. What drew you to studying déjà vu, and what aspects of the phenomenon are you kind of most interested in looking at?
So I became interested in the study of déjà vu around 20 years ago or so. I had been studying an aspect of memory known as familiarity-based recognition. In fact, I had a career grant called familiarity-based recognition. And so the way that I had been studying that in the laboratory was to have people make familiarity judgments for different types of stimuli during incidents of recall failure, where people couldn't recall anything specific that the stimulus might have reminded them of, but could feel a sense of familiarity nonetheless. So I had been in the process of doing this research on familiarity-based recognition when a researcher named Alan Brown published a paper in the journal Psychological Bulletin on the déjà vu experience. And it was the first time any researcher had published an article for mainstream scientists, mainly cognitive scientists, but psychologists more broadly, on the phenomenon of déjà vu. So he brought it into the realm of science, and that was the first time. In addition, it wasn't just a review of what had been done up until that point, and what had been done up until that point had basically been survey research, survey studies of people's déjà vu experiences. No one had really attempted to study it in a laboratory setting yet or to induce it through experiments.
Was it seen more as like a kind of an eerie supernatural thing then, or what was the view of it at that time?
So I think at that time, probably a big reason scientists had steered clear of studying déjà vu was precisely because it has this association with the paranormal. In fact, even in Alan Brown's review paper, even though it was a scientific journal, he acknowledged in parts that some of the surveys that he was pulling from were of a paranormal flavor. And so I think there was that element, keeping it out of science. And this was the first time that a scientific paper on the subject had emerged in the mainstream literature. And it wasn't just a review. It was also really a call to cognitive scientists to take up its study in the laboratory. And so in addition to reviewing what he could pull out of these various surveys that had been carried out over the decades, Alan Brown really pointed out a number of different ways that cognitive scientists could study déjà vu in the laboratory. And so I really took up that invitation because at the time I had been studying this aspect of memory, familiarity-based recognition, and immediately saw links between what I was already studying, people's sense of familiarity when they can't recall anything specific, and Alan Brown's call to scientists to take up the study of déjà vu.
It sounds like that's really the point where it kind of went from that. It made that jump from the paranormal, the unknown, to really becoming legitimate.
Yeah, I see that paper as a critical catalyst for enabling scientists to take up this study. You didn't really see anyone, including myself, taking up its study in laboratory settings until that point in time. And then after that point, you do see papers starting to emerge, including my own, over the years, studying déjà vu in a scientific setting.
What was the reaction that you got from other people in your field? Were they like, What are you doing? Or were they excited or
Both. So there was some excitement, but I think there was some skepticism at first and a reluctance. In fact, after our initial studies on déjà vu that I thought were really neat studies that were the first to test an almost century-old hypothesis of déjà vu that had never been studied, there was skepticism by reviewers. It was actually quite difficult to get our first papers published because there was this skepticism that you could even study déjà vu in a laboratory setting, or that if you get participants to report feelings of déjà vu in a laboratory setting, how do you know that's the real déjà vu? How could you possibly induce that in a laboratory setting? It's too mysterious. It's too eerie. It can't be the real thing because it would be impossible to duplicate that. There was really this skepticism among a lot of people that it was something that could be studied.
So how do you study déjà vu? I mean, how do you trigger that in people?
The approach that we've taken followed from my initial studies of familiarity-based recognition, where what I would do in the lab is ask people for judgments of familiarity. We would familiarize stimuli in the laboratory and then examine instances where people could recognize that something was familiar. So, for example, a face that had been familiarized in the lab, but not be able to pinpoint why it's familiar or what the source of that familiarity was. And so it wasn't too far a leap to take that approach to studying déjà vu. So the approach we took actually follows from a number of suggestions that Alan Brown made in his initial review paper. One was something that was pulled from survey research. So across many, many survey studies across the decades, one trend that emerged was that the most common elicitor of déjà vu is scenes or places. And so that was one of the patterns that Alan was able to pull from surveys. The other piece is a specific hypothesis that Alan put forward in his review paper and suggested could be studied in a lab, but hadn't. And that is what's known as the Gestalt familiarity hypothesis. It's the idea that maybe déjà vu emerges because you enter a scene or a place, and even though you've never been in that specific scene or place before, it has the same layout, the same configuration of elements, like the placement of furniture, for example, relative to one another, as another place that you've been in your past, and you're just failing to recall that experience as the source of the familiarity with this current scene. And so that hypothesis had been out there in the literature, but never tested. It's a really conducive hypothesis to being tested in a laboratory setting, particularly with the advent of virtual reality, because what we could do is create lots of different scenes, some of which have the same spatial arrangement on a grid, but are otherwise distinct from one another. So, for example, maybe a bedroom scene has the exact same spatial layout as a clothing store, or a bowling alley has the exact same spatial layout as a subway station, or a courtyard, exact same configuration of elements as a museum scene.
And you got a unique introduction to that from a popular game.
Yes. So when we first did this study, it was actually many years ago before virtual reality as we know it today. And so what we did was we used the early 2000s game called The Sims. And if you're familiar with The Sims, I mean, it's a life simulation game that allows you to create houses and landscapes for your people to live in as part of the game. And often what people will do is they'll create elaborate mansions and gardens and sophisticated landscapes or even schools and museums. You can get really creative with this gaming platform and put the virtual tours on YouTube even. So if you look on YouTube, even today, you'll see people's creations of various Sims houses and structures. And so we use that platform to create a number of scenes that were otherwise distinct from one another, but each of which had a pair that had the identical layout but was otherwise distinct. And we essentially took people on virtual tours, much like the Sims game was designed to do, but in more of an experimental environment.
And today it's a little more, as you mentioned, a little more high-tech, but same concept.
Yes. So we've since upgraded our approach. In fact, quite recently, as the Sims game doesn't work anymore in modern-day computers. In fact, I think we had to use a CD to get the game to run. And so in order to allow other scientists to use the paradigm and replicate and extend the findings, we really needed to upgrade our approach. And so we in fact, this past year published our upgraded version of the program, which is publicly available now on the Open Science Framework. So other researchers could pull from that to use it. And so same concept, though, same idea. I worked with a student from Emory University named Noah Okada. He was a computer science undergraduate, now a graduate student at Caltech, who basically recreated all of the scenes using the same idea, but being creative himself. So he created novel scenes, but following from the same logic and approach.
And so what did you find as you were doing experiments and seeing how people reacted to these very similar images?
So I come from a very long tradition in memory research of studying memory processes by giving people lists of things to remember and then giving them tests, like a recognition test, and having them do things like discriminate old from new or make familiarity judgments or try to recall something from earlier on in the experiment that a cue on a test might remind them of. It was a virtual reality version of that where people would be basically zapped from one scene to the next. And today, our most common version or variant of this paradigm is to get pulled through a scene in a series of twists and turns like you're on a tour of it in virtual reality. You're wearing a headset. You can turn your head to look around and explore as you're being moved through the scene. And so you go through a number of these. You're touring different scenes and exploring them. And then in a later phase of the experiment, it's the same thing. You're going through a number of different scenes. They're all unique, except later in the experiment, some of the scenes in a randomized order have the same spatial layout as a scene that you've already toured earlier in the experiment. And so in the test phase, we do prompt people. So at the end of the tour, we'll typically give a number of prompts. We'll ask, did you feel déjà vu as you were in that scene? How familiar do you find that scene is a common prompt that we give people. And finally, we ask, did this scene remind you of something specific? Did you think of a specific earlier scene that you think resembles this scene? And it's interesting to listen to people as they're in the virtual reality talk about it. You can just hear it in their speech, where they'll often say, oh, wow, I'm having déjà vu, and I just have this feeling that I've been here before, but I know that I haven't. So that has led us to right now we're actually carrying out a study in which people are doing their thinking out loud because they love to talk when they're in virtual reality doing this. And so now we're trying to see, well, what linguistic elements seem to accompany déjà vu, and what can we glean from that?
Let's talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions that people have. There's a definite tie-in. People associate it with,
Yes.
spooky kind of paranormal experience. They think it's otherworldly. They think it's maybe even a form of premonition.
Yes.
Is there anything to that, or is that a lot of Hollywood and a lot of just our imaginations going a little wild?
It's an interesting aspect of déjà vu. So years ago, when I published my first papers on the Gestalt familiarity hypothesis of déjà vu, I would get some pushback, usually from members of the public who would come across media reports of the articles and reach out either over email or by phone or sometimes by letter to tell me they thought that I was wrong, that it can't just be a memory phenomenon because for them it's a precognition. I'm using air quotes as I say this because I wasn't familiar with that term precognition, but I think it comes from the paranormal realm or paranormal literature. And to many people, this is a part of their déjà vu experience. And so at first, years ago, I was sort of dismissive. As a scientist, I thought, I wonder why people think this. It must just be a bias people have. They just have this belief that that's what déjà vu is. But I would think to myself, well, that can't be what it is, and so it's probably just this pervasive belief. But it kept happening, including at academic conferences, graduate students. And sometimes PhDs would come up to my students' posters or to me after I'd given a talk and tell us that their experience it's this sense of prediction or predicting the future. And for many people, it's not just a sense. They feel like they really did predict what was going to happen next. And I started to realize this is a really common experience that people have. It doesn't seem like it's just a belief, but that when they have déjà vu, it really strongly feels like it's accompanied by a feeling of prediction and sometimes the actual sense that you really predicted, you knew exactly what was going to happen next, and it happened in exactly that way. And so I became interested in trying to study that. And in fact, had been thinking about it for years. How would I go about studying that? and eventually came up with this idea that maybe it too is driven by memory. Maybe if a past situation dynamically unfolds in a very similar way to a current situation, maybe that unrecalled memory, in the same way that the unrecalled memory for a layout can contribute to the sense of having been in a place before that you know you haven't been, maybe the way that an event dynamically unfolded over time in the past is leading you not only to feel a high sense of having been in this event before, but also a sense of knowing where it's going and what's going to happen next. And so to develop a way to test that in the lab, basically, I came up with this idea that using the Sims virtual tour paradigm where you're pulling people through each scene from a first-person perspective, what we could do is pull people through scenes in the study phase, what we call the encoding phase, in a series of twists and turns within each scene. And then in the test phase, when they're being pulled through an identically configured scene, have that tour stop short of a turn that was taken earlier and see, could people predict what the direction of the next turn should be in that test scene, even if they can't recall the earlier scene that's the source of any sense of what the direction of the next turn should be. And so it seemed like a great way to test this hypothesis that maybe it's a memory-driven phenomenon that is allowing people to be able to predict the future in a sense, because it's really the past that's enabling it. Unfortunately, at the time when we ran that study, it didn't work, or it didn't work insofar as people had no predictive ability that was grounded in memory, unless, of course, they recalled the earlier scene. When they did recall a specific scene, then they could predict what the direction should be on the basis of that recalled memory of a highly similar scene and what the direction of the turn was there. But our primary interest was in when people can't recall, can they just have this sense, right? Like when they're having déjà vu, feeling like they've been in this scene before, knowing that they haven't, does that enable a sense of prediction even though they can't recall and have no idea why? Because if so, that would help to explain this mysterious sense of predicting the future. But again, unfortunately, there was no predictive ability. We found our usual déjà vu effects, but just déjà vu wasn't associated with any actual predictive ability. So I kind of sat on that study for at least a year or two, thinking of it as kind of a failure. Like it was a great idea, but it didn't work, so that's not it. And then one day it occurred to me that we hadn't asked them if they felt that they could predict. And so I went back to the lab and decided to test that. So ran the same study, but added in a question about, do you feel as if you could predict the direction of the next term? And what we found was this enormous sense of prediction, that when people felt like they were having déjà vu, they felt very strongly that they could predict the direction of that next turn, even though they actually could not. So in replication of our earlier study, there was no actual prediction, but what was fascinating was that there was a very, very strong feeling of prediction accompanying that sense of déjà vu. And so that was our first step toward trying to get at or understand this idea, this association between déjà vu and feelings of premonition. We've since replicated that basic illusory sense of prediction many times. So it's a very robust, very large effect. And what it suggests is that while we don't fully understand why it's there yet, it's there. And so when people experience déjà vu, it very often is accompanied by a very strong feeling of knowing what's about to happen. It's not every déjà vu experience, so it's not as if people simply define déjà vu as prediction. It's roughly half of their déjà vu reports in the lab are accompanied by this strong sense of being able to predict what's going to happen next, but not every instance.
So you're talking a lot about places. When I have déjà vu, it's often a conversation.
That is the second most common elicitor of déjà vu, according to the survey research.
And I have to admit, I feel like I knew they were going to say that. I knew it's really strong that you're like, I knew that conversation was going to happen, but it's never happened before. But it feels like I had it before.
Yeah, very common. Yep. So second most common elicitor is conversations.
Is there a big difference in why that happens?
So far in my lab, we've been focusing on places as the elicitor, and we haven't looked at conversations yet. I think primarily because of the logistics involved in trying to create that in something like virtual reality. It's not impossible. You know, we've talked about, my students and I, about the possibility of creating avatars that might talk to you and gesture and say things. And could we somehow mimic that experience of feeling like you're talking to someone for the first time, but you feel like they've said this before and you know where this conversation is going or what they're about to say next? And so I think you could design an experiment like that. It's just a little bit trickier because of the complexity. Compared to just putting elements of furniture and things on a grid, in VR it would require this more sophisticated set of avatars who are gesturing and making facial expressions. But, someday we may do that. I think it's a great idea and definitely a good next question. And then we could start to compare, are they phenomenologically different experiences when it's a place versus when it's a person or a conversation?
It feels like most things have a purpose. Most things that we experience, there's a reason for it, even if we don't know what it is. So why would déjà vu be an important biological function?
Yeah. And I think that's the million-dollar question. I used to approach the study of déjà vu as if it's just an odd quirk of memory that's interesting to study and we don't really know why it's there. And in fact, even thought of it years ago as perhaps just a side effect or residual aspect of other memory processes, that maybe it doesn't have an important aspect to itself. It just sort of is this lingering after effect. But I've changed my mind on that. I actually now think that it probably does have a useful purpose and is there for a reason. Specifically, I think, and this is based on more recent evidence coming out of our lab that has caused us to really rethink this, that it's not just a quirk, it's there for a reason. I think it's there to redirect our attention and have us focus in on our own memories and look for information from our memories that might be relevant to the current situation at hand that we find ourselves in. And so where that idea came from is actually interesting. Prior to Noah Okada, the student I mentioned earlier, prior to that, I had pretty much created all of the scenes that we were using in the Sims games. Years ago, I spent a lot of time playing that game and constructing these scenes for research. And so I never got the chance to experience déjà vu myself in the VR environment because every time I would go in to test the program or just explore, I knew every scene because I had created them. And I knew which scenes mapped onto which others, and it wasn't that interesting to me. But when Noah first sent over the HTC Vive program for me to test out in my lab to get ready to run here at CSU, I got to go through this program for the first time not knowing what any of the scenes were or what any test scenes mapped onto because I hadn't created them. They were all new to me. And so while I was in the test phase exploring the scenes that he'd created, what I noticed was that I was very impressed with the creativity that went into creating these scenes. I was exploring them, really admiring, looking around, turning my head and oohing and aahing, thinking, oh, look at this granite countertop and that bowl on top of it, such detail, or the tile on the floor, everything had such detail. And the creative placement of different pieces of artwork and elements, it was just very detailed, very high resolution, impressive VR environments. And so I was very much enjoying being pulled through these scenes. They were novel to me. I'd never seen any of them before, and it was very interesting to explore. And as I'm doing this, as I'd been through several different scenes already at this point, all of a sudden, as I'm getting pulled through this sort of beach resort scene that had little huts and tiki torches, and it was a boardwalk near the water, I was overcome with this sense of, oh my gosh, I feel like I've been through this exact scene on this exact path. I know I haven't, and I recognized it as novel that I hadn't explored a beach resort scene yet. And so what I found myself doing is suddenly I stopped exploring the scene. I stopped taking in the details as I was being pulled through the rest of it and was instead racking my brain, looking inward, searching my memory, trying to conjure up candidate scenes that I'd already been through from earlier from my memory as possibilities for why I was having this intense feeling of familiarity that really felt like déjà vu. And so my attention turned inward. I was no longer exploring the scene. I was searching my mind for an explanation for why am I having this. And it happened to me several more times throughout the rest of the tours, but it really got me thinking. I thought, oh, is that what participants in our studies, is that what it feels like to them? Because if it does, that might be a missing piece that it hadn't occurred to us to explore yet. And that is that when it happens, it switches your attention from being outward focused to being inward focused to searching your memory. And it got me thinking that might be the purpose of déjà vu. It turns your attention inward and gets you searching your memory for something that might be relevant to the situation at hand. And if you think about it, that's probably a very useful purpose. It's sort of your brain telling you stop, there's something here, and you really should figure out what is it that's familiar about this scene.
I love the idea that it's actually your brain trying to give you a little kick to stop what you're doing and take note and
Yeah, I love that, a little kick. Yeah, and that's kind of how I think of it now, that its purpose is to give you a little kick or a nudge to search your memory that might not otherwise occur. You might just keep exploring the scene, but the sense of familiarity is sort of an alert that there's something here that you've done before. Try to figure out what it is. I think it's telling us something important, perhaps, about how the mind works more generally. We don't really know a whole lot at this point in cognitive science about what causes our attention to flip inward when it was outward focused. So in cognitive science, there have been decades and decades of studies on attention telling us what in the environment can pull our attention outward. So we know that when something's novel, it'll tend to grab our attention outward. If something's salient in the environment, it'll tend to pull our attention outward toward it. But we don't know much about what in the environment might instead send our attention inward toward our own memories. And so I think it's telling us something important there about how our attention gets redirected, sometimes involuntarily. So if you think about it, déjà vu is not really a voluntary form of cognition. It just happens to us. And when it does, it seems like it takes a front seat to whatever it was we were focusing on. It grabs our attention and holds it and redirects our focus. And that may be telling us something very important about how our mind does refocus.
when you have déjà vu, it does feel eerie. Is there an element to that that's important? Why do we have that spooky feeling? It's so palpable.
Yeah. In fact, people love using the word spooky. So even when I talk about déjà vu and our déjà vu research at scientific conferences, sometimes a scientist will raise their hand and say, "But what about the spooky element of déjà vu?
Why is it so spooky?"
Yeah. It's interesting that we tend to remember it as if it was spooky or eerie when it happened. Some of my collaborators and I have been looking at, well, what are the emotional aspects? What is this phenomenology, the subjective qualities of the experience itself? Is it really spooky? Is it kind of negative? Or is it more positive? We're starting to find evidence to suggest when it does happen, at least in the moments that it happens, it's kind of positive. That if we look at, for example, machine learning approaches, something called natural language processing, to examine people's language when they do answer survey questions about their déjà vu experiences, they tend to have a positive slant to the descriptions of déjà vu in the language that they're using. And so it's an interesting question. Why is it so associated with the spooky? Is it because it has this paranormal, sort of societal paranormal expectation around it or belief system around it? Or is there something else that leads us to feel like when we have déjà vu, it's spooky? I don't have an answer to that yet, but we're doing a lot of studies right now, mainly with machine learning in collaboration with some folks in computer science here at CSU to try to start to get at that. So looking at people's language, if they talk out loud while they're in virtual reality, for example, can we then take the language itself and train machine learning algorithms to differentiate when people do have déjà vu versus when they don't? Are there linguistic qualities that seem to differentiate? And if so, are they sort of spooky qualities? Is their language indicating spookiness at all? Does the word spooky come up at all in their language? I mean, that's a good question that I think we might be able to answer soon as we explore this.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was CSU psychology professor Ann Cleary speaking about the memory phenomenon known as déjà vu. I'm your host, Stacey Nick, and you're listening to CSU's The Audit.